With Henry now the head of the church in England, he wasted no time in imposing his authority. In 1534, the great Catholic monasteries began to be dismantled. Unacceptable symbols of a church still loyal to the Pope. On the 3rd of December 1538, Rievaulx, a 12th century Cistercian abbey, closed its doors for the last time.
But the destruction of these powerhouses of prayer had a profound effect. One that formed the backdrop to Cranmer's decision that a new prayer book in English was vital for the survival of the church in England.
It wasn't just the lead roofs and stained glass windows that disappeared from these buildings. It was the constant round of monastic prayers and rituals.
These monasteries were hubs of pilgrimage, where the laity came to ask for prayers. The monks here prayed 8 offices a day from a breviary, that's their daily prayer book. So everything from matins through to vespers. These rituals formed the backbone of the religious life in England. If they were gone, something was needed to replace them.
And it wasn't just the monasteries that were changing. During the 1530s, reforms were being passed. There were fewer holy days, an end to pilgrimages, and no cult of saints. All to reflect the shift away from Rome.
These changes in religious structure and belief needed to be echoed in the worship of the church. Its prayers, its rituals, its creeds, all stemmed from an institution with the Pope at its head. A new liturgy to unite a new church in England, stripped of its popish practices, was absolutely vital.
As the great monasteries fell silent, Cranmer began work on his Book of Common Prayer. It was in the winter of 1538, in the London palace of the Archbishops of Canterbury, that Cranmer's believed to have begun the labour of love that would destroy him.
It's amazing to think of Cranmer being here and wrestling with the book that would come to define him. We know he consulted a large number of different sources, like these, copies of the Sarum rites. They're collections of the most common forms of worship in the Catholic Church in England, going back to the 11th century. But he also read the works of German Lutheran Protestants and even Spanish prayers in search of the perfect words and expressions to describe the important moments in life. Things like birth, death, marriage, the passing of the seasons, but most importantly, the new beliefs of the reformers in England.
And at the heart of the work lay a ritual so sacred that to question it was to be burnt for heresy. In the last years of Henry's reign, English evangelicals were starting to interrogate the central rite at the heart of Catholicism, the Mass, and the idea of transubstantiation. These reformers shockingly denied the real presence of Christ's body, claiming that communion was merely a ritual of remembrance. Their views were so controversial, they were condemned to death.
Cranmer stayed away from their arrests and examinations, perhaps because he secretly shared their heretical beliefs. Beliefs that would have cost him his life if he'd confessed them.
And although he may well have been working on a Eucharist service with these new ideas at their heart, while Henry was alive, any ambitions he had to make them real were impossible.
Despite his rejection of the Pope, King Henry was at heart traditionally Catholic. He believed in the real presence in the Latin Mass. He and his conservative bishops dealt ruthlessly with anyone who didn't share their religious views.
It would take the death of the monarch who'd handed him power to enable Cranmer to realise his Protestant ambitions. And in 1547, his opportunity came. On the 28th of January, Henry died. His son, Edward, the first monarch ever to be raised a Protestant, was crowned aged only 9.
With Henry dead, the remnants of Catholicism he'd clung to could begin to be dismantled. It was the moment for Cranmer to realise the religious revolution he'd waited for, with his own prayer book at its heart.
Within 6 months, all religious processions were banned. Worship no longer spilt onto England's streets. And in 1548, Cranmer finally began lobbying for his prayer book to replace all Catholic worship in England.
But it wasn't straightforward. The church was split, with conservatives on one side and reformers on the other. The controversial issue of the Eucharist was even passionately debated for 5 days at the House of Lords. It was during these discussions that Cranmer, for the first time, publicly revealed beliefs he'd held private, namely that he no longer believed in the real presence at the Mass.
Despite its lack of universal support, Cranmer got his way, and an act was passed making the Book of Common Prayer compulsory in every church in England.
Why was the Book of Common Prayer one of the most important books written in the English language?
Well, the Book of Common Prayer provides a template for practicing religion in a completely different way. It states it, first of all, just if you look at the page here from the preface, which was written by Cranmer, the reason for the book, he says, is that the service in this Church of England, these many years, he says, hath been read in Latin to the people, which they understood not, so that they have heard with their ears only, and their hearts, spirit, and mind have not been edified thereby. Now, we might take that in terms of the difference between Latin and English simply, but what Cranmer's most interested in is the bit about in their heart, spirit, and mind. He thinks that if you can't understand the service, you can't internalise it, and if you haven't internalised it, that's not proper religion. So he's trying to replace what he thinks of as being a religion which is communal and perhaps learned by rote with something which is felt by every person in an individual way.
With his work now complete, in 1549 the Archbishop unveiled his masterpiece. In the very place Tyndale's New Testament had been burned as heresy, now congregations could hear his words at the heart of a liturgy in their own tongue.
This was a moment of triumph for Cranmer, the culmination of years of planning, meticulous hard work, and the absolute conviction that in the words of this book lay the path to true salvation.
The Book of Common Prayer still forms the basis of worship in Anglican churches around the world. Its words marking life, death, birth, and marriage, giving us phrases that are part of the bloodstream of our lives, to love and to cherish, lighten our darkness, ashes to ashes. And at its heart was the new rite of communion, no longer a moment of miracle, but a service of remembrance. The book was a practical manifesto of a religious revolution now placed in every church. But the reaction to Cranmer's great work wasn't celebration, but violent revolt. From the early summer of 1549, the compulsory introduction of Cranmer's new book to replace the well-loved Latin Mass provoked outrage. Across the counties of Devon and Cornwall, men rose up and began to march in bloody battle for the liturgy of England.
The rebellion began in the small Devon village of Sandford Courtenay. The parish priest waited until the final date allowed by the government before he introduced the new prayer book. But his parishioners rose up. They forced him to wear the old popish attire and to say at Mass and all such services as in times past accustomed.
In their makeshift camps, rebel groups began to gather and burn copies of the offending work. In July, they laid siege to Exeter.
For these intensely loyal Catholics, the demand to use the new prayer book wasn't just an attack on long-cherished beliefs. It was the final provocation for a people who felt that the rituals and customs that held the fabric of their lives together were being ripped apart.
And for many, the power of the Mass lay in the mystery of its language. Take that away, and the ritual was merely words.
Being able to read the Bible in English was one thing, but the enforced introduction of a new service in English was quite another.
News of the uprising was slow to reach London, but when it did, the reprisals were devastating. On the 3rd of August, royal forces descended on the rebel stronghold of Clyst St Mary. The village was set alight and the soldiers ordered to kill their captives.
The army were utterly ruthless. Ordinary men armed with nothing more than pitchforks were crushed by thousands of English soldiers, backed up by mercenaries from Germany, Italy and Albania. Here, in one of the bloodiest moments of the rebellion, in just 10 minutes, 900 men had their throats slit. It was the beginning of the end for the rebels. By August, the rebellion was all but over.
Nearly 4,000 men lost their lives in the rebellion. Men prepared to die for the sake of a book. But Cranmer's vision to reject England's 1,000-year Catholic past was abruptly halted. In 1553, the Protestant boy king Edward contracted tuberculosis, and within months he was dead. The night before his funeral, his body was carried into Westminster Abbey. Around him gathered his court, reformers who knew their dreams of a Protestant future were now in jeopardy.
The heir to the throne was Mary, the daughter of Henry and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. As a committed Catholic, she had every reason to hate all that her half-brother and his advisors stood for. On that August night, as the Archbishop stood by the body of the young king he'd invested so much in, he knew that his time was running out. He had humiliated the new Queen's mother by granting Henry a divorce from her. He'd destroyed the religion that she loved so much and even declared Mary illegitimate. He knew the time would come when Catherine of Aragon's daughter would exact a terrible revenge.
With Mary's return, England went into sharp reverse. She began a dramatic reintroduction of the Catholic rituals that Cranmer had begun to tear apart. And within a month of her coronation, Latin Mass was once more heard in churches across the land. Cranmer was furious and privately wrote condemning this insult to the Eucharist. But his letter was leaked and copies spread across London before he was ready to make his views known.
He made the best of a terrible situation. Instead of denying the words he'd written, he published more copies. In it, he denounced the Latin Mass as of the devil's devising. And he defended his own work, saying it was more pure and according to God's word than any that hath been used in England this 1,000 years.
For Mary's government, Cranmer's words were incendiary. Only months after Edward's death, he was taken to the Tower of London. He would never be a free man again. It was in Oxford that Cranmer faced his dramatic end. As he waited for his execution, from his prison window he was forced to watch the procession of the Blessed Sacrament. The ceremonies he had banned, Mary Tudor had reinstated. On a rainy morning in March, he was led to the University Church to make his final statement. As he processed up the aisle with the sound of the Catholic liturgy in his ears, to those watching, Cranmer appeared to be a man defeated.
The religious zealot who had spearheaded the Reformation had descended into a spiral of loneliness, fear, and doubt. In this fragile state, he signed no less than 6 dramatic recantations of everything he had worked his whole life to achieve.
Before Cranmer spoke, the Provost of Eton, Henry Cole, sent by Queen Mary, gave a sermon in which he listed the reasons for Cranmer's death. Reasons he read from a statement Cranmer himself had signed only 3 days before.
In front of a packed church, Cole explained why, despite having repented of his sins, Cranmer still had to burn for his heresies, and the charges which he himself admitted being guilty of were read out. Masterminding the divorce of Henry VIII from Catherine of Aragon, and the denial of the real presence in the Mass, the central belief at the heart of the book he thrust on every church in England, and an act which he himself admitted had put other souls in jeopardy. In his statement, he begged the forgiveness of the Pope and Queen Mary.
As Cole finished, the waiting crowds would have been on tenterhooks as the once all-powerful Archbishop started to speak.
Cranmer began by asking the assembled masses to pray for his forgiveness, but he enigmatically added, "Yet one thing grieveth my conscience more than all the rest, whereof, God willing, I intend to speak more hereafter."
The listening officials had a copy of what he was expected to say, that it was his untrue books and writings contrary to the truth of God's word that so troubled him. But it suddenly became clear this was not Cranmer's intention at all.
Instead, he said, "The writing that was contrary to the truth I thought in my heart and was written for fear of death consisted of all such papers I have written and signed since my degradation. And as for the Pope, I refuse him as Christ's enemy, as Antichrist, with all his false doctrines. And as for the sacrament, I believe as I have taught in my book."
Cranmer could barely be heard in the commotion that followed. He was pulled from the stage and dragged through the streets to the stake, amid scenes of chaos. As the wood was lit, the fallen Archbishop stretched out his hand in one final defiant gesture. "For as much as my hand offended, writing contrary to my hand shall first be punished." Although he knew his final hours were a triumph for the Protestant cause, he must have feared that his hopes for a reformed England would die with him.
Little did he know his death was just the beginning. The dream he died for would not only become a reality, but within a decade, every English church would echo with the words of the liturgy in which he so passionately believed.
His prayer book would not only survive, but go on to define the soul of a nation for over 400 years.